London, spring 1821. The season of social revelation had arrived with the blooming of cherry trees in Mayfair's pristine squares, where Georgian mansions stood like monuments to centuries of accumulated wealth and privilege. In this world of rigid hierarchy, where bloodlines determined destiny and a single misstep could shatter reputations like crystal against marble, the ton gathered in their finest silks and satins to witness the dance of marriage, politics, and power. Lady Lydia Ashford moved through the opulent ballroom of Pemberton House with the grace of someone born to command attention. Her emerald silk gown, adorned with seed pearls that caught the light of 1,000 candles suspended from crystal chandeliers, whispered against the polished marble floors as she navigated between clusters of England's most influential families. The ballroom itself was a masterpiece of Georgian architecture, with soaring ceilings painted with cherubs and mythological scenes, mirrors framed in gold that reflected the dancing flames, and French doors that opened onto terraced gardens where moonlight illuminated perfectly manicured hedgerows. At 22, Lydia possessed an ethereal beauty that seemed to glow from within. Her auburn hair was arranged in the latest fashion, with delicate curls framing her porcelain complexion, while emeralds and diamonds adorned her throat and wrists, family heirlooms, she claimed, passed down through generations of distinguished Ashfords. Her cornflower blue eyes held depths that suggested both innocence and wisdom, an intriguing combination that drew gentlemen like moths to flame and made ladies whisper behind their fans with equal measures of admiration and envy. The Ashford name itself carried weight in society's carefully maintained ledgers of lineage. According to the elaborate fiction Lydia had constructed over 3 careful years, her family traced their roots to Norman conquest, with holdings in Yorkshire that had supposedly been in their possession since the 13th century. She spoke eloquently of ancient family traditions, of summers spent at a sprawling estate called Thornfield Manor, of ancestors who had served kings and died honorably in foreign wars. Every detail had been meticulously crafted, every story polished until it gleamed with the patina of truth. Tonight's gathering represented the pinnacle of London's social calendar. The Pemberton family, whose wealth rivaled that of minor royalty, had opened their magnificent home to celebrate the engagement of their eldest daughter to the Duke of Somerset's heir. The guest list read like a directory of Britain's most powerful families, dukes and duchesses, marquises and marchionesses, earls and countesses who controlled vast estates, commanded seats in Parliament, and wielded influence that extended from the drawing rooms of Mayfair to the corridors of Whitehall. The protocols governing such gatherings were as complex as they were unforgiving. Every introduction followed precise rules of precedence, every conversation navigated treacherous waters of alliance and rivalry, every dance carried the potential for scandal or triumph. Ladies were expected to demonstrate accomplishments in music, languages, and watercolor painting, while gentlemen displayed their worth through knowledge of politics, hunting, and the management of their estates. Marriage negotiations proceeded with the delicacy of diplomatic treaties, with dowries and settlements discussed in hushed conferences between fathers while their children performed the elaborate courtship rituals sanctioned by society. Lydia had mastered these conventions with remarkable skill. Her French was flawless, her Italian charming, her watercolors praised by masters of the art. She played the pianoforte with sensitivity that brought tears to listeners' eyes and danced with such natural elegance that partnerships with her were coveted by the most eligible bachelors. Her conversation sparkled with wit and intelligence, carefully calibrated to display learning without appearing too intellectual, charm without seeming forward, and spirit without suggesting impropriety. The deception had begun 3 years earlier when Lydia arrived in London with a modest fortune and an elaborate background story. She had rented a tastefully appointed townhouse in a respectable area of Mayfair, hired a small but impeccably trained staff, and begun the delicate process of inserting herself into society's lower tiers. Her approach had been gradual and methodical, charitable work that brought her into contact with established families, artistic salons where her accomplishments could be displayed, carefully orchestrated introductions through mutual acquaintances who vouched for her character and breeding. The fictional Yorkshire estate had been inspired by extensive research in county records and architectural books. Lydia could describe Thornfield Manor's long gallery with its portraits of distinguished ancestors, the library with its collection of rare first editions, the conservatory where exotic orchids bloomed year-round tended by a master gardener brought from Kew. She spoke knowledgeably of tenant farmers and crop rotations, of shooting parties and local magistrate duties, of church patronage and village improvements. When pressed for specific details, she had ready explanations. The estate was being renovated, she preferred London society to country isolation. Distant relatives were currently managing the property in her absence. Her financial resources, while not unlimited, were sufficient to maintain the illusion. The modest inheritance from her supposed parents had been augmented by careful investments and prudent management. She lived comfortably but not ostentatiously, maintaining a lifestyle that suggested old money rather than new wealth. Her jewelry was genuine but not excessive, her clothing fashionable but not cutting edge, her entertaining elegant but not lavish. Everything was calculated to support the impression of inherited wealth managed with proper restraint. The social architecture of Regency England provided perfect cover for her deception. The ton was large enough that not everyone knew everyone else, particularly among the lesser nobility and landed gentry. Families frequently traveled between London and country estates, making temporary absences unremarkable. The complex web of marriages, alliances, and business relationships meant that introductions often came through chains of mutual acquaintances, each assuming the others had properly verified credentials. Social mobility, while rare, was not unknown. The children of successful merchants sometimes married into minor nobility, bringing fresh wealth to ancient names. Lydia's greatest asset was her genuine refinement. Whatever her true origins, she possessed an innate understanding of grace and elegance that could not be taught. Her movements flowed with natural poise, her voice carried the musical cadences of educated speech, her manners demonstrated the unconscious confidence that came from believing in one's own worth. She had transformed herself so completely that the performance had become reality. The assumed role had shaped the performer until distinction between truth and fiction blurred beyond recognition. As the evening progressed, the familiar patterns of high society entertainment unfolded with clockwork precision. Gentlemen discussed politics and business in the card room while ladies gossiped in the drawing room. Young couples danced under the watchful eyes of chaperones and matchmaking mothers. Widows and confirmed bachelors flirted with the freedom that came from established positions, while debutantes navigated their first season with mixture of excitement and terror. The orchestra played Viennese waltzes and English country dances, the servants circulated with champagne and delicate refreshments, the conversation buzzed with news of parliament, court, and scandal. Lydia found herself at the center of multiple conversations, her wit and charm drawing admirers like iron filings to a magnet. Lord Hammond complimented her watercolor technique, having seen her latest work displayed at the Somerset House exhibition. The Countess of Blackwood sought her opinion on the latest novel by Sir Walter Scott, knowing Lydia's literary tastes were both informed and discerning. Young Mr. Fitzgerald begged for the honor of escorting her to the opera next week, while his sister whispered questions about Lydia's modiste, eager to discover the source of such elegant fashion. Through it all, Lydia maintained her carefully constructed persona with the skill of a master actress. Every response reinforced her fictional background, every gesture demonstrated her supposed breeding, every interaction strengthened the web of relationships that supported her position in society. She was living proof that identity was performance, that nobility was behavior rather than birth, that the human heart could be trained to beat in rhythm with any chosen destiny. But even the most perfectly constructed deceptions carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. In a world where information was currency and secrets were weapons, where every family's history was documented in church registers and county records, where genealogical research was a popular pastime among the educated classes, the truth was a patient enemy that waited for its moment to strike. The second act of Lydia's carefully orchestrated evening began as the dancing commenced in earnest. The musicians, positioned in an elegant gallery overlooking the ballroom, struck up the opening chords of a popular contradance, and couples began forming sets with the practiced ease of those born to such entertainments. The intricate patterns of the dance mirrored the complex social choreography that governed every interaction, where the wrong step could lead to social disaster and perfect execution earned admiration that extended far beyond the ballroom. It was during the third set that Lord Edmund Blackwood approached Lydia with a request that would alter the trajectory of both their lives. Edmund was 28 years old, the second son of the Earl of Blackwood, a family whose lineage stretched back to the Wars of the Roses and whose current wealth derived from extensive coal mining operations in the North Country. Unlike many gentlemen of his generation who lived lives of idle pleasure, Edmund had distinguished himself through service in the diplomatic corps, spending 5 years managing delicate negotiations in Vienna and Paris before returning to London to assist his father with the family's business interests. His appearance commanded immediate attention without demanding it. Standing well over 6 feet, with dark hair that refused to submit entirely to the pomade fashion required, and eyes the color of storm clouds over the moors. Edmund possessed the kind of masculine beauty that made young ladies forget their carefully rehearsed conversation and mothers begin calculating dowries. His evening clothes were expertly tailored in the understated elegance that marked true aristocracy: black superfine wool coat with crystal buttons, pristine white waistcoat and cravat, knee breeches, and silk stockings that displayed his athletic build without ostentation. "Miss Ashford," he said, offering a bow that was precisely calibrated to demonstrate respect without suggesting subservience, "would you honor me with the next set?" Lydia's heart performed an unexpected acrobatic feat that she prayed was not visible on her face. She had observed Edmund from afar during previous social gatherings, noting the way other ladies sought his attention and the respectful deference shown him by gentlemen despite his status as a second son. His reputation was sterling, intelligent, honorable, financially independent through wise investments, and refreshingly free from the gambling debts and mistresses that plagued so many of his contemporaries. "The honor would be mine, Lord Blackwood," she replied, placing her gloved hand lightly on his offered arm and allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. The contradance they performed was itself a microcosm of courtship, with partners advancing and retreating, circling and separating, their hands touching and releasing according to ancient patterns that symbolized the elaborate negotiations of romantic pursuit. Edmund proved to be an excellent dancer, his movements confident and graceful, his timing perfect as he guided Lydia through the intricate figures. During the brief moments when the dance brought them close enough for conversation, their exchange sparkled with the kind of wit that indicated matching intelligence. "I understand you have recently returned from Italy, Miss Ashford," Edmund said as they moved through a particularly complex figure that required them to weave between other couples. "Indeed, Lord Blackwood. I spent 6 months in Florence studying Renaissance art with Maestro Giovanni Benedetti." "The experience was quite illuminating," Lydia replied, grateful that her fictional Italian sojourn was supported by extensive research and a genuine appreciation for art that she had cultivated through countless hours in London's galleries and museums. "How fascinating. I have always believed that travel broadens the mind in ways that mere books cannot accomplish. I found my years on the continent similarly educational, though I fear diplomatic negotiations leave little time for artistic appreciation." As the dance concluded and Edmund escorted her from the floor, Lydia felt the dangerous thrill of genuine attraction overlaying her calculated performance. This was an emotion she had not anticipated and could not entirely control, a variable that threatened to disrupt the careful equilibrium she had maintained for 3 years. Edmund's interest appeared equally genuine, his attention focused on her with an intensity that suggested more than polite social obligation. Their conversation continued as he procured glasses of champagne and they found seats in a charming alcove overlooking the garden. The setting was perfection itself. The alcove was furnished with delicate gilt chairs upholstered in cream silk, small tables holding arrangements of white roses and jasmine, and tall windows draped in gossamer curtains that filtered the moonlight into a romantic glow. From this vantage point, they could observe the ongoing festivities while enjoying a measure of privacy that allowed for more intimate discourse. Edmund proved to be an engaging conversationalist, equally comfortable discussing political developments in Parliament, the latest scientific discoveries being presented to the Royal Society, and the literary merits of contemporary poets. His education at Oxford was evident in his classical references and philosophical observations, while his diplomatic experience had taught him to listen as carefully as he spoke, to find the deeper currents of meaning beneath surface pleasantries. "Your perspective on Wordsworth's latest collection is quite refreshing, Miss Ashford," he commented after they had engaged in a spirited discussion of romantic poetry. "So many young ladies seem to admire verse primarily for its sentimental value rather than its artistic merit. I believe poetry should speak to both heart and mind, Lord Blackwood. Beauty without meaning is merely decoration, while meaning without beauty is mere instruction. The greatest poets achieve harmony between emotion and intellect." Their dialogue was interrupted by the approach of Lady Victoria Pemberton, their hostess for the evening and a young woman whose beauty was matched only by her ambition and whose friendship with Lydia had always carried an undercurrent of competitive tension. Victoria was 20 years old, blessed with the kind of golden blonde perfection that artists love to paint and poets struggle to describe adequately. Her pale blue silk gown was adorned with sapphires that complemented her eyes, and her manner carried the unconscious authority of someone who had never doubted her place at the pinnacle of society. "Dear Lydia, how lovely to see you enjoying yourself so thoroughly," Victoria said with a smile that managed to be both warm and calculating. "Lord Blackwood, I hope you are finding our little gathering diverting." The subtext of Victoria's interruption was clear to all three participants in this social tableau. She had romantic aspirations regarding Edmund that were encouraged by both families, as a match between the Blackwood and Pemberton lines would unite two considerable fortunes and strengthen both families' political influence. Edmund's apparent interest in Lydia represented a significant threat to these carefully laid plans. "Lady Victoria, your parents have created an enchanting evening," Edmund replied diplomatically. "The company is particularly distinguished." The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of polite warfare, with each participant maneuvering for advantage while maintaining the surface civility that society demanded. Victoria made several pointed references to childhood memories she supposedly shared with Edmund, while subtly questioning Lydia about her family connections and Yorkshire estate. Lydia parried these probes with practiced skill, deflecting inquiries with charming anecdotes and redirecting conversation towards safer topics. The tension was broken by the arrival of Mr. Charles Whitmore, a gentleman of independent means whose primary occupation appeared to be the collection and dissemination of society gossip. Charles possessed the useful talent of being simultaneously entertaining and harmless, making him welcome at every gathering despite his rather obvious pleasure in other people's secrets. His appearance was unremarkable, medium height, pleasant features, impeccable grooming, but his conversation sparkled with insider knowledge and amusing observations about their mutual acquaintances. "Have you heard the delicious rumors about the Duchess of Marlborough's latest escapade?" Charles inquired with the barely contained excitement of someone in possession of particularly choice gossip. "It seems Her Grace was seen taking private driving lessons from a certain handsome young groom, and the Duke is said to be less than pleased with these educational endeavors." The group laughed at this scandal, which was shocking enough to be interesting but not serious enough to be truly damaging. Such stories provided the social lubrication that kept conversation flowing at gatherings where the same people encountered each other repeatedly throughout the season. As the evening progressed, Lydia found herself increasingly drawn to Edmund's company while simultaneously aware of the growing scrutiny her actions were receiving from other guests. Lady Victoria's mother, the formidable Countess of Pemberton, observed their interactions with the sharp attention of a general studying enemy movements. Several other mothers whose daughters harbored matrimonial hopes regarding Lord Blackwood exchanged meaningful glances and whispered comments behind their fans. The complex dynamics of attraction, ambition, and social positioning played out against the backdrop of continuing entertainment. More sets were danced, more champagne was consumed, more introductions were made and alliances negotiated. The younger set engaged in the elaborate flirtations that constituted approved courtship behavior, while their elders discussed matters of greater substance, the ongoing political reforms being debated in Parliament, the latest news from the continent where revolutionary stirrings continued to worry established governments, the economic implications of expanding trade with the Orient. Lydia navigated these various conversations with the skill that had established her reputation as one of the season's most sought-after young ladies. Her opinions were informed but not controversial, her manner engaging but not forward, her attention flattering but not exclusive. She was careful to distribute her social capital wisely, ensuring that no one felt slighted while giving Edmund just enough encouragement to maintain his interest without creating the impression of improper forward behavior. The evening's musical entertainment reached its crescendo with a performance by Miss Arabella Fitzgerald, widely acknowledged as one of the most accomplished young pianists in London society. Her interpretation of a Mozart sonata was both technically perfect and emotionally moving, demonstrating the kind of artistic achievement that elevated social gatherings beyond mere entertainment into cultural events worthy of serious appreciation. As Miss Fitzgerald's final notes faded into reverent silence, followed by enthusiastic applause, Lydia felt Edmund's gaze upon her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. The look they exchanged contained depths of meaning that transcended the polite interactions that had characterized their evening's conversation. In that moment, the dangerous alchemy of attraction threatened to overwhelm the careful calculation that had governed her behavior for 3 years. "Miss Ashford," Edmund said quietly as the applause died away and conversation resumed around them, "I wonder if you might allow me to call upon you tomorrow afternoon. There are matters I would very much like to discuss with you in a more private setting." The request, while perfectly proper according to social convention, carried implications that both understood. Lydia's acceptance would signal her willingness to entertain serious courtship, while refusal would close a door that might not open again. The decision required balancing her genuine feelings against the practical considerations that had guided every choice she had made since arriving in London. "I should be delighted to receive you, Lord Blackwood," she replied, her voice steady despite the turbulence of her emotions. "Shall we say 4 o'clock?" As the evening drew toward its conclusion and guests began the elaborate process of departure, retrieving wraps, summoning carriages, making final social connections, Lydia felt the weight of the step she had just taken. Her deception, successful for 3 years, had just encountered its greatest challenge, the possibility of genuine love with a man whose integrity and social position demanded absolute honesty from those who would share his life. The following afternoon arrived with the soft golden light of spring filtering through the lace curtains of Lydia's drawing room, where every detail had been arranged to create an atmosphere of refined domesticity. Fresh flowers from Covent Garden Market, white roses, lavender freesia, and delicate lily of the valley, filled crystal vases placed strategically throughout the room, their fragrance mingling with the subtle scent of beeswax polish on mahogany furniture and the faint aroma of tea brewing in the kitchens below. Lydia had chosen her afternoon dress with particular care, a creation in pale blue muslin adorned with tiny pearl buttons and delicate embroidery that suggested both innocence and sophistication. Her hair was arranged in soft curls that framed her face while still maintaining the proper formality expected of an unmarried lady receiving gentlemen callers. Every aspect of her appearance and surroundings was calculated to support the impression of genteel breeding and tasteful affluence that formed the foundation of her elaborate fiction. Mrs. Hartford, her elderly companion and chaperone, sat discreetly in the corner with her needlework, providing the proper supervision that society demanded while remaining sufficiently unobtrusive that private conversation could proceed. Mrs. Hartford was a genuine widow of reduced circumstances whose presence lent additional credibility to Lydia's household arrangements. The older woman had been carefully selected not only for her impeccable reputation and understanding of social conventions, but also for her failing hearing, which allowed for more intimate discourse than might otherwise be possible. When Lord Edmund Blackwood was announced at precisely 4 o'clock, Lydia felt her heart perform the same unexpected acrobatics that had surprised her the previous evening. Edmund appeared even more handsome in the afternoon light streaming through her windows, his dark hair gleaming with subtle highlights and his storm-gray eyes bright with intelligence and something deeper that she dared not name. His morning coat was perfectly tailored in bottle-green superfine wool, worn over buff-colored pantaloons and polished Hessian boots that spoke of wealth managed with restraint rather than ostentation. "Miss Ashford," he said, offering a bow that was both respectful and slightly warmer than mere formality required, "thank you for receiving me. Your drawing room is quite charming, the atmosphere suggests both comfort and refinement. You are very kind, Lord Blackwood. Please, do be seated. Mrs. Hartford and I were just about to take tea. I hope you will join us." The ritual of tea service provided a graceful framework for the beginning of their private acquaintance. Lydia moved through the familiar motions, warming the pot, measuring leaves, steeping to perfection, serving with the precise movements that demonstrated breeding, while Edmund observed with the appreciation of someone who understood that such accomplishments were markers of proper education and domestic competence. The conversation began with safe topics, commentary on the previous evening's entertainment, observations about the unusually fine weather, discussion of current cultural events in London. Gradually, as comfort levels increased and the tea service created natural pauses in conversation, their discourse deepened into more personal territory. Edmund spoke of his diplomatic service in Vienna, describing the intricate negotiations that had occupied months of delicate maneuvering between representatives of various European powers still adjusting to the post-Napoleonic political landscape. "The art of diplomacy," he explained, setting down his teacup with thoughtful precision, "requires one to discern truth beneath layers of polite deception. Every participant arrives with hidden motivations and carefully constructed presentations of their positions. Success depends upon recognizing what is genuine and what is performance." Lydia felt a chill of apprehension at his words, wondering if some unconscious perception had guided him toward this particular topic. How fascinating it must be to navigate such complex waters. "I imagine the ability to read character accurately becomes quite essential in such work." "Indeed. I have learned to pay attention to small details, the consistency of stories told on different occasions, the alignment between claimed backgrounds and demonstrated knowledge, the ways in which people respond to unexpected questions." Edmund's gaze held hers steadily as he spoke, and Lydia fought to maintain her composure while wondering whether his comments carried specific meaning or represented merely general conversation about his professional experiences. Their discussion moved on to safer ground as Edmund inquired about her artistic pursuits. Lydia found herself on firmer footing as she described her watercolor techniques and her supposed studies in Italy, topics where her genuine knowledge and passion could shine without relying solely on fictional foundation. Edmund's responses revealed his own considerable education in classical art and contemporary artistic movements, creating a meeting of minds that transcended mere social pleasantries. "Your description of the light in Tuscan landscapes is quite vivid, Miss Ashford. I spent some time in Florence myself during my continental service and found the quality of illumination there unlike anything in northern climates. The way morning light transforms the Arno Valley is particularly memorable." Lydia agreed enthusiastically, drawing upon her extensive research and genuine artistic sensibility to paint word pictures of scenes she had never witnessed but could imagine with startling clarity. Her facility with these descriptions came from hours spent studying travel accounts, examining paintings, and cultivating the visual imagination that made her fictional experiences feel real even to herself. As their conversation continued, Edmund began sharing more personal aspects of his background. He spoke of his childhood at Blackwood Hall, the family estate in Derbyshire, describing the ancient oak forests that gave the property its name and the medieval tower that formed the heart of their sprawling manor house. His affection for the landscape was evident as he painted pictures of misty mornings over the moors, the satisfaction of managing tenant farms and overseeing improvements to the property, the pleasure of long rides through countryside that had been shaped by generations of his ancestors. "There is something deeply satisfying about connection to land that has been in one's family for centuries," he mused, gazing out the window toward the small garden behind Lydia's townhouse. "Each generation builds upon the foundations laid by those who came before, creating something larger and more enduring than individual achievement." These words struck Lydia with particular force, highlighting the contrast between his genuine heritage and her manufactured identity. The longing in his voice when he spoke of ancestral connections emphasized everything she lacked: the deep roots, the unquestioned belonging, the security that came from knowing exactly where and to whom one belonged. Her own fictional Yorkshire estate suddenly seemed pallid in comparison to his lived reality of generational stewardship and organic growth. Edmund's stories of family traditions fascinated and intimidated her in equal measure. He described Christmas celebrations that followed patterns established decades earlier, with specific dishes prepared according to recipes handed down from previous generations, particular carols sung in the family chapel, and gift-giving customs that reflected the relationships between the estate and its surrounding community. His summer house parties brought together childhood friends whose families had been allies for generations, creating networks of loyalty and mutual support that transcended individual personalities. Family history provides such rich foundation for understanding oneself, Lydia commented carefully, hoping to encourage further revelation while avoiding direct questions about her own supposed background. The stories passed down through generations create such vivid sense of continuity. Exactly so. My grandmother, who lived to the remarkable age of 93, could recall tales from her own childhood that connected our family to events of national significance. Through her memories, the Battle of Trafalgar and the Congress of Vienna seemed as immediate as yesterday's newspaper. Such living connections to history create profound sense of place in the larger story of our nation. Their afternoon together stretched longer than the conventional hour typically allotted to social calls, neither participant seeming eager to bring the encounter to its conclusion. Edmund's conversation revealed depths of character that went far beyond his reputation for diplomatic skill and financial acumen. His interests ranged from natural philosophy to agricultural innovation, from classical literature to contemporary political theory. He spoke passionately about educational reforms he hoped to implement for the children on his estate, progressive farming techniques he was testing on experimental plots, and correspondence he maintained with leading intellectuals across Europe. Lydia found herself genuinely impressed by his breadth of knowledge and strength of character. This was not the idle aristocrat she had encountered so frequently in London society, but a man of substance who took seriously his responsibilities to family, estate, and nation. The growing attraction she felt was based not merely on his handsome appearance and eligible status, but on recognition of qualities that commanded respect and admiration. As the afternoon light began to fade toward evening, Edmund finally made motions toward departure, but not before making a request that set Lydia's pulse racing with equal measures of excitement and trepidation. "Miss Ashford, I wonder if you might honor me with your company at the opera tomorrow evening. La Traviata is being performed at Covent Garden, and I understand the production is quite exceptional. If you would consent to join me, along with appropriate chaperonage of course, I should be delighted to arrange a box for the evening." The invitation represented a significant escalation in their courtship, moving beyond private calls to public appearances that would be noted and discussed throughout society. Attendance at the opera in Edmund's company would signal to all observers that their acquaintance had progressed to serious courtship, with all the expectations and scrutiny such recognition entailed. "I should be honored to accompany you, Lord Blackwood," Lydia replied, her voice steady despite the tumultuous emotions his invitation had triggered. "Mrs. Hartford and I will be delighted to join you for what I am certain will be a memorable evening." After Edmund's departure, Lydia sat alone in her drawing room as twilight gathered outside her windows, reviewing the afternoon's conversation and contemplating the implications of their deepening relationship. Every exchange had revealed new layers of Edmund's character while requiring her to construct additional elaborations of her fictional background. The effort of maintaining her deception while genuinely engaging with someone whose intelligence and integrity she respected was becoming increasingly exhausting. Mrs. Hartford, who had observed the afternoon's proceedings with the shrewd attention of someone whose survival depended upon understanding social undercurrents, approached Lydia with a mixture of concern and maternal affection. "That young man is quite taken with you, my dear," she observed quietly. "His intentions appear entirely honorable, and his character seems beyond reproach. But I sense something in your manner that suggests apprehension rather than simple maidenly nervousness. Is there anything troubling you about this developing attachment?" Lydia looked at the older woman who had become not merely her companion but something approaching a confidant, wondering how much truth she dared reveal. Mrs. Hartford had never questioned the details of Lydia's background beyond what was necessary for maintaining appearances, but her experience of the world had taught her to recognize when surfaces concealed deeper complexities. "I find Lord Blackwood's attention quite overwhelming, Mrs. Hartford. His expectations of family connections and social position are rather elevated. I sometimes wonder whether I can live up to such standards." "Nonsense, child. You conduct yourself with more grace and dignity than half the young ladies who claim ancient bloodlines. Lord Blackwood would be fortunate indeed to secure your affections. Do not allow self-doubt to prevent you from accepting happiness when it presents itself." As night fell over London and Lydia prepared for bed, she carried with her the weight of choices that loomed ahead. Edmund's courtship was proceeding exactly as every romantic fantasy had imagined, but the foundation of deception beneath her feet grew more treacherous with each step forward. The opera invitation would mark her first major public appearance as the object of his attentions, subjecting her to the focused scrutiny of society matrons whose hobby was uncovering secrets and whose entertainment was destroying reputations. The evening at Covent Garden Opera House unfolded with all the magnificent splendor that made such occasions memorable touchstones in the social calendar of London's elite. The theatre itself was a temple to artistic refinement, with its soaring interior decorated in cream and gold, multiple tiers of boxes filled with the fashionably dressed occupants of society's upper echelons, and a sense of anticipation that crackled through the air like electricity before a storm. The production of La Traviata featured the celebrated Italian soprano Madame Isabella Fortuny, whose reputation for dramatic intensity had drawn audiences from across Europe to witness her interpretation of Verdi's tragic heroine. Edmund had secured a prime box on the grand tier, positioned to provide excellent views of both the stage and the social theatre that played out in the opposite boxes throughout the evening. Lydia arrived in a gown of midnight blue silk adorned with silver embroidery that caught the gaslight and created an effect of starlight across water. Her jewelry was modest but genuine, a delicate sapphire necklace and matching earrings that complemented her coloring while maintaining the restrained elegance appropriate to her supposed station. Mrs. Hartford accompanied them as chaperone, dressed in respectable dark gray silk that demonstrated propriety without drawing attention from her charge. The first act proceeded with all the passionate intensity that made Verdi's masterpiece so compelling, but Lydia found her attention divided between the drama unfolding on stage and the awareness of countless eyes upon their box. Through her opera glasses, she could observe the subtle but unmistakable interest their presence generated throughout the theatre. Lady Victoria Pemberton sat in a box directly across from them, her golden beauty highlighted by rose silk and diamonds, her attention fixed more upon Edmund and Lydia than upon the performance. The Countess of Pemberton's expression suggested careful calculation as she assessed the implications of this public display of courtship. During the interval, their box became a receiving chamber for the steady stream of acquaintances who paid their respects. Lord and Lady Ashworth complimented Lydia on her appearance and discussed the merits of Madame Fortuny's interpretation. Mr. Charles Whitmore arrived with the latest gossip about various couples whose romantic attachments were providing entertainment for society observers. The Duke of Wellington himself stopped briefly to exchange pleasantries with Edmund about recent political developments, acknowledging Lydia with the courteous attention that indicated her growing acceptance among the highest circles. It was during this social interval that the first crack appeared in the carefully constructed edifice of Lydia's deception. Lady Beatrice Hartwell, an elderly dowager whose encyclopedic knowledge of genealogy made her the unofficial arbiter of bloodline authenticity, approached their box with the purposeful manner of someone conducting important research. "My dear Miss Ashford," Lady Beatrice began with a smile that was both warm and penetratingly intelligent, "I have been meaning to speak with you about your family connections. You see, I have been corresponding with my dear friend Lady Margaret Thornfield, who has recently returned to Yorkshire after spending several years in Bath for her health. She mentioned that she knows the Thornfield estate quite well, having grown up in the neighboring county, and was curious about the current state of your family's property." Lydia felt her blood turn to ice water even as she maintained her composed exterior. Lady Beatrice's inquiry, delivered with perfect social pleasantness, carried the unmistakable weight of investigation. The fictional estate she had named as her family seat was apparently real enough to have actual neighbors who might know its true ownership and current circumstances. "How delightful to hear of Lady Margaret's recovery," Lydia replied smoothly, her voice betraying none of the panic that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "I fear I have not been in residence at Thornfield for some time, preferring the cultural advantages of London society. The estate is currently being managed by my cousin, who has taken responsibility for its day-to-day operations while I pursue my artistic studies." "Indeed? How interesting." Lady Margaret mentioned that she understood Thornfield to be owned by the Morrison family, who have held it since the mid-17th century. Perhaps she was mistaken about the property's name, or perhaps there are multiple estates in the region with similar designations. The conversation continued with deadly politeness, each exchange revealing additional inconsistencies in Lydia's carefully constructed background. Lady Beatrice's questions, framed as innocent curiosity about family connections and regional geography, systematically exposed the fictional nature of claims that had gone unchallenged for 3 years. Edmund listened to this exchange with growing attention, his diplomatic training having taught him to recognize the subtle signs of interrogation disguised as social conversation. When Lady Beatrice finally moved on to other social obligations, the atmosphere in their box had shifted perceptibly. Mrs. Hartford looked genuinely puzzled by the dowager's questions, while Edmund's expression had taken on the careful neutrality that Lydia recognized from his descriptions of delicate diplomatic negotiations. "That was rather an odd conversation," Mrs. Hartford observed quietly. Lady Beatrice seemed quite well informed about Yorkshire geography for someone whose primary estate is in Devon. The second act of the opera provided temporary respite from social scrutiny, but Lydia found herself unable to concentrate on the tragic romance unfolding on stage. Her mind raced through possible explanations and defensive strategies, while simultaneously acknowledging that her deception had encountered its first serious challenge from someone with both the knowledge and social position to expose her completely. Edmund's behavior throughout the remainder of the evening remained perfectly courteous, but Lydia detected subtle changes in his manner that suggested growing uncertainty about her background. His questions became more specific, his observations more pointed, his attention more analytical than romantic. The diplomatic skills that made him valuable in international negotiations were now being applied to the puzzle of her identity, and she felt the weight of professional scrutiny that was far more dangerous than social curiosity. The journey home in Edmund's carriage proceeded in relative silence, with conversation limited to polite commentary on the evening's musical performances. When they reached Lydia's townhouse, Edmund assisted her from the carriage with his customary courtesy but without the lingering touch and meaningful glances that had characterized their previous interactions. "Miss Ashford," he said formally as they stood before her door, "I wonder if I might call upon you tomorrow afternoon. There are several matters I believe we should discuss privately." The tone of his request made clear that their next meeting would address topics far more serious than courtship pleasantries. Lydia accepted his proposal with outward calm while inwardly preparing for what might well be the final chapter of her London adventure. The following afternoon arrived grey and threatening, with storm clouds gathering over the city in what seemed an appropriately dramatic backdrop for the conversation that would determine her future. Edmund arrived precisely on time, but his manner was markedly different from their previous encounters. Gone was the warmth and growing intimacy that had characterized their developing relationship, replaced by the careful courtesy of a diplomat conducting difficult negotiations with a foreign power whose trustworthiness remained in question. "Miss Ashford," he began after the usual preliminaries had been observed and Mrs. Hartford had withdrawn to a discreet distance, "I hope you will forgive my directness, but recent events have raised questions about your background that I feel compelled to address openly." Lydia steeled herself for the confrontation she had dreaded for 3 years while praying that her carefully prepared explanations might still preserve some remnant of the life she had built. "After our conversation with Lady Beatrice last evening, I took the liberty of conducting some research into Yorkshire property records. I discovered that Thornfield Manor is indeed a real estate, but it has been owned by the Morrison family for over 2 centuries and is currently inhabited by elderly Mr. James Morrison and his unmarried daughter. There is no record of any Ashford family connection to the property, nor any evidence of the extensive renovations you have described." The words fell into the quiet drawing room like stones into still water, each revelation creating ripples that spread outward to disturb every aspect of the reality Lydia had constructed. Edmund's voice remained steady and professional, but she could detect the underlying disappointment and betrayal that his diplomatic training could not entirely conceal. "Furthermore," he continued relentlessly, "I made inquiries through my contacts in the diplomatic service about the maestro Giovanni Benedetti with whom you claim to have studied in Florence. The cultural attaché at our embassy there informs me that no such artist is known in Florence's artistic community, nor has been for at least the past decade." Lydia felt the carefully constructed walls of her deception crumbling around her like a castle built on sand facing the incoming tide. Every detail she had crafted with such care, every story she had polished until it gleamed with apparent authenticity, was being systematically dismantled by someone with the resources and motivation to verify her claims. "Lord Blackwood," she began, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to maintain composure, "I can explain these apparent discrepancies." "Can you?" Edmund interrupted, his storm-gray eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Because I have also discovered that there is no record of any Ashford family among the landed gentry of Yorkshire, nor indeed of any family by that name holding property of significance anywhere in England. The Ashford lineage you have described so eloquently appears to exist only in fiction." The silence that followed this revelation stretched between them like a chasm that could not be bridged by any explanation or excuse. Lydia found herself facing the moment she had alternately dreaded and anticipated for 3 years, the complete exposure of her deception before someone whose opinion had come to matter more than her own safety. "Who are you?" Edmund asked quietly, the question carrying the weight of broken trust and shattered illusions. "What is your real name, your true background, your actual circumstances?" "I believe I deserve honest answers to these questions, given the intimacy that has developed between us and the expectations that your deception has encouraged." The question hung in the air between them like a sword suspended by the finest thread, poised to cut through every pretense that had defined Lydia's existence for the past 3 years. She looked into Edmund's storm-gray eyes and saw not just disappointment, but the deeper pain of someone who had opened his heart only to discover that the object of his affection was built upon lies as substantial as morning mist. For the first time since arriving in London, Lydia found herself without a carefully prepared response, without a polished explanation that could transform uncomfortable truth into acceptable fiction. The weight of maintaining her deception for so long had exhausted her capacity for further invention, and she discovered in herself an unexpected longing for the relief that truth might bring, even if it destroyed everything she had worked to achieve. "My real name," she said slowly, each word feeling like a stone being lifted from her chest, "is Lydia Margaret Sinclair. I was born in Whitechapel, the daughter of a seamstress and a man who abandoned us before my 2nd birthday. My mother died of consumption when I was 15, leaving me with nothing but her sewing skills and a determination to escape the poverty that had defined every day of my childhood." Edmund's expression remained carefully neutral, but she could see the subtle tightening around his eyes that indicated the shock of learning just how vast the gulf was between her claimed identity and her actual origins. Whitechapel was a world away from Mayfair, not merely in geography but in every aspect of social reality. The elegant young lady who had charmed London society was revealing herself to be precisely the kind of person that society was designed to exclude. I spent 2 years working in a dress shop in Cheapside, Lydia continued, finding that once begun, the truth flowed more easily than lies ever had. The proprietress, Mrs. Gardiner, was a kind woman who recognized that I possessed qualities that might carry me beyond my circumstances if properly cultivated. She taught me to speak correctly, to carry myself with dignity, to understand the subtle codes that govern proper behavior. When she died and left me a small inheritance, I saw an opportunity to transform myself completely. The story of her transformation was both remarkable and heartbreaking in its calculation. Using Mrs. Gardiner's legacy and her own savings from 2 years of careful economy, Lydia had created the fictional identity of Miss Lydia Ashford with the same attention to detail that an architect might bring to designing a cathedral. Every aspect of her background had been researched and crafted to withstand casual scrutiny while avoiding the kind of specific claims that might be easily verified. I spent months in the British Museum and various libraries, studying genealogical records and county histories to create a plausible family background. I observed ladies of quality in shops and at public events, noting their mannerisms, their speech patterns, their choices in clothing and accessories. I hired an elocution teacher and a dancing master, practiced watercolor painting until my fingers cramped, and read voraciously to acquire the education that birth should have provided. Edmund listened to this recitation with the careful attention he had once given to diplomatic briefings, but Lydia could see the growing comprehension of just how comprehensive her deception had been. She was not merely a young woman who had exaggerated her family's importance or embellished certain details of her background. She was someone who had invented an entirely fictional identity and maintained it with a skill that bordered on artistry. The most difficult aspect, she admitted, was learning to think like someone born to privilege rather than someone who had studied it from the outside. I had to train myself to take certain assumptions for granted, to speak of servants and estates and family traditions as if they were natural parts of my experience rather than carefully researched performance pieces. Mrs. Hartford, who had been sitting in stunned silence throughout these revelations, finally found her voice. "My dear child, you mean to say that everything, your family, your estate, your entire background, was invented? Everything except my genuine affection for art, literature, and learning. Those passions were real, as was my appreciation for beauty and refinement. I may have been born in poverty, but I was not born without the capacity to appreciate and create beauty. My circumstances were false, but my character, at least the admirable parts of it, was genuine." Edmund rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the gray afternoon while processing the magnitude of what he had learned. When he turned back to face her, his expression was unreadable, showing neither the anger she expected nor the disgust she feared, but something more complex that might have been a mixture of admiration and betrayal. "The scope of your deception is remarkable," he said quietly. "To maintain such an elaborate fiction for 3 years, to convince not merely casual acquaintances but society's most discerning observers, it requires intelligence, determination, and acting ability of the highest order. Under different circumstances, I might actually admire such achievement." "But these are not different circumstances," Lydia replied, understanding the unspoken conclusion of his observation. "These are the circumstances in which I deceived you specifically, encouraged your attentions under false pretenses, and allowed you to develop feelings for someone who does not exist." The conversation that followed was perhaps the most honest exchange either of them had ever experienced. Edmund's disappointment was profound, but it was tempered by his recognition of the extraordinary circumstances that had driven Lydia to such desperate measures. His diplomatic experience had taught him to understand complex motivations and to recognize that actions which appeared reprehensible might stem from understandable, even sympathetic, origins. "What I find most difficult to accept," he said after a long pause, "is not that you concealed your humble origins. Such prejudices are society's failing, not yours. What troubles me is that you allowed our relationship to develop knowing that it was built upon fundamental dishonesty. Did you never consider the consequences of success? Did you never imagine what would happen if someone actually fell in love with Miss Lydia Ashford?" The question struck at the heart of Lydia's carefully maintained emotional defenses. She had planned for discovery, prepared for exposure, anticipated social ruin, but she had never allowed herself to consider the possibility that someone might love her deeply enough that her deception would cause genuine heartbreak rather than mere embarrassment. I told myself that such feelings were impossible, she admitted. I convinced myself that aristocratic marriages were business arrangements dressed up as romance, that affection between social equals was merely a pleasant bonus rather than the foundation of lasting happiness. I never anticipated that someone like you might offer the kind of love that demands absolute honesty in return. Edmund's response revealed depths of character that made Lydia's growing affection for him even more painful. Rather than condemning her for her deception, he sought to understand the desperation that had driven her to such lengths. His questions explored not just what she had done, but why she had felt it necessary, what alternatives she had considered, what hopes and fears had shaped her choices. The tragedy, he observed, is that the qualities I found most admirable in Miss Lydia Ashford, your intelligence, your refinement, your appreciation for beauty and learning, appear to be genuinely yours. The deception was in the circumstances of your birth and upbringing, not in your character or capabilities. This recognition led to the most painful part of their conversation, the acknowledgement that under different social circumstances, their attachment might have developed into something genuine and lasting. Edmund's feelings for her had been based on qualities she actually possessed, while her growing love for him was founded on his authentic character rather than any fictional attributes. If you had approached me honestly from the beginning, he said, if you had trusted me with the truth of your circumstances, we might have found a way to overcome the barriers that society places between us. My family's position is secure enough that we could weather certain kinds of scandal, and my own convictions favor merit over accident of birth. But would you have noticed me at all if I had appeared in society as Lydia Sinclair, seamstress from Whitechapel? She asked, voicing the doubt that had driven her to deception in the first place. Would any of you have seen past my origins to discover whatever admirable qualities I might possess? The question illuminated the fundamental injustice that had motivated her deception while simultaneously highlighting its tragic consequences. Society's rigid prejudices made advancement on merit nearly impossible for someone of her background, yet the very methods she had employed to circumvent those prejudices had made genuine relationships equally impossible. The afternoon wore on as they explored every aspect of her situation, from the practical details of how she had maintained her fiction to the emotional cost of living constantly on guard against discovery. Edmund's diplomatic training served them both well, as his ability to negotiate complex situations helped them find a path toward understanding if not resolution. The immediate question, he said finally, is what happens now? Lady Beatrice's inquiries will undoubtedly continue, and others will follow her lead once suspicions are aroused. Your position in society is almost certainly unsustainable, regardless of any steps we might take to protect you. Lydia nodded, having reached the same conclusion herself. The careful edifice she had built was crumbling, and no amount of explanation or excuse could rebuild it once doubt had been cast upon its foundations. Her 3 years as Miss Lydia Ashford were drawing to their inevitable close. I understand, she said quietly. I have always known that discovery would mean the end of everything I had built here. I am prepared to leave London, to disappear quietly and allow Miss Lydia Ashford to fade from memory as if she had never existed. But Edmund's response surprised her with its intensity and determination. That may be what society expects, but it is not what I am prepared to accept. You may have deceived me about your background, but you have not deceived me about your character. The woman I came to love exists, regardless of her name or birthplace. The days following Lydia's confession to Edmund passed in a state of suspended animation, as if the normal flow of time had been interrupted by the weight of decisions that would reshape multiple lives. London society continued its relentless round of entertainments and obligations, but for Lydia, the familiar patterns felt like watching a play from backstage, observing performances she could no longer join while awaiting her cue to exit the stage forever. Edmund's initial response to her revelations had been more generous than she had dared hope, but she understood that his immediate reaction might differ from his considered judgment after having time to fully process the magnitude of her deception. The social implications of their relationship were staggering: his reputation, his family standing, his political and diplomatic career, all could be damaged by association with someone whose entire identity had been fabricated. Mrs. Hartford, whose world had been equally shaken by the revelations, proved unexpectedly supportive once the initial shock had passed. My dear, she said during one of their quiet conversations as they sat in the drawing room that might soon be occupied by strangers, I have observed you carefully for over a year, and whatever your origins, you have conducted yourself with more genuine nobility than half the ladies who claim ancient bloodlines. Character is what a person chooses to become, not what circumstances choose for them. The older woman's acceptance provided comfort, but it could not resolve the larger questions that loomed over their future. Word of Lady Beatrice's inquiries had begun circulating through the intricate network of social connections that governed London society. No direct accusations had been made, but the subtle shift in atmosphere was unmistakable to someone trained to read social undercurrents. Lady Victoria Pemberton was among the first to sense opportunity in the growing whispers surrounding Lydia's background. Her visit on the third day after the opera, ostensibly a social call to discuss an upcoming charity bazaar, carried the unmistakable air of reconnaissance and barely concealed triumph. "Dearest Lydia," Victoria said with honeyed concern, "I do hope you are not feeling unwell. You seemed somewhat distracted at the opera, and Lady Beatrice mentioned that she found your conversation about Yorkshire quite interesting." The subtext was clear. Victoria knew that Lydia's position was vulnerable and intended to press whatever advantage the situation might provide. Her romantic aspirations regarding Edmund had never been abandoned, merely temporarily overshadowed by his apparent interest in Lydia. If doubts about Lydia's background created an opening, Victoria was prepared to exploit it with the ruthless efficiency that characterized the marriage market among England's elite. "I am quite well, thank you," Lydia replied with the composure that had served her so faithfully for 3 years. "I fear Lady Beatrice may have misunderstood some references to family properties. The details of estate management can be quite complex, particularly when properties have been in family hands for generations." Their conversation continued with the elaborate politeness that characterized warfare among ladies of quality, each participant maneuvering for advantage while maintaining the surface civility that society demanded. Victoria's questions, framed as friendly concern, systematically probed for weaknesses in Lydia's carefully constructed background, while Lydia's responses deflected inquiry without providing the additional ammunition that direct lies might supply. The encounter left Lydia drained but also strangely liberated. The exhausting effort of maintaining her deception under increasingly hostile scrutiny made the prospect of honesty seem like a gift she might give herself, regardless of the consequences. 3 years of constant vigilance had taken a toll that she was only beginning to recognize now that the end appeared inevitable. Edmund's behavior during this period was a study in internal conflict made manifest through carefully controlled external behavior. He continued to call upon her, but their conversations had taken on the careful formality of diplomatic negotiations rather than the growing intimacy that had characterized their courtship. He was clearly wrestling with questions that went far beyond simple romantic attachment, considering implications for his family, his position, and his own sense of honor and integrity. It was during their 5th meeting since her confession that Edmund finally revealed the decision he had reached after days of careful consideration. "Lydia," he said, using her real name for the first time since learning it, "I have spent considerable time reflecting upon our situation and the choices that lie before us. I have concluded that society's prejudices, however powerful, need not dictate the course of our lives." She looked at him with a mixture of hope and apprehension, hardly daring to believe that he might have found a path through the seemingly impossible circumstances that surrounded them. "I am prepared to offer you marriage," he continued, "not despite your true background, but because I have come to understand that your true background is irrelevant to your worth as a person. The woman I fell in love with exists, regardless of the circumstances of her birth or the methods she employed to rise above them." The proposal, delivered with Edmund's characteristic directness tempered by genuine warmth, represented both salvation and new challenges. Marriage to him would provide protection from social ostracism while requiring them to navigate the complex reactions of families and friends who would struggle to accept such an unconventional alliance. "Edmund," Lydia said softly, "your generosity overwhelms me, but I cannot accept such sacrifice on my behalf. Your position in society, your family's reputation, your own future, all would be compromised by association with someone whose entire identity has been revealed as fabrication." "You underestimate both my determination and my family's character," he replied with a smile that transformed his serious expression into something approaching joy. "I have already spoken with my father about the situation, and while he was initially shocked, he has come to agree that love based on genuine compatibility should not be sacrificed to social prejudice." The conversation that followed revealed the depth of Edmund's commitment and the careful planning he had undertaken to make their marriage possible. His diplomatic connections would facilitate their temporary removal from London society while the immediate scandal died down. His family's estate in Derbyshire would provide refuge where Lydia could be introduced gradually to their circle as his chosen bride. His financial independence meant that they could weather any temporary social ostracism while building a life based on mutual respect and shared values. "But what of your career?" Lydia asked, still struggling to believe that someone would willingly sacrifice so much for her sake. "Your diplomatic service, your political aspirations, surely these would be damaged by marriage to someone with my background." "Perhaps initially," Edmund acknowledged, "but I have reason to believe that talent and integrity ultimately matter more than social connections, particularly in diplomatic work where understanding different perspectives and navigating complex situations are valued skills. Your own experience of transformation and adaptation might actually prove advantageous in representing British interests abroad." The practical arrangements for their future began to take shape as they discussed the realities of building a life together despite social obstacles. They would marry quietly in the chapel at Blackwood Hall, with only immediate family present to witness the ceremony. The announcement would emphasize Edmund's choice of a bride based on personal merit rather than social position, challenging their peers to follow their example in valuing character over circumstance. Lydia's transition from Miss Lydia Ashford to Mrs. Edmund Blackwood would require careful management but offered the possibility of redemption through honesty rather than continued deception. Her true background would be acknowledged quietly among their intimate circle while the broader society would be encouraged to focus on her accomplishments and character rather than her origins. The wedding, when it took place 6 weeks later in the ancient stone chapel that had served the Blackwood family for 3 centuries, was simultaneously intimate and profoundly symbolic. Lydia wore a gown of ivory silk that had belonged to Edmund's grandmother, carrying white roses from the estate's gardens and wearing the Blackwood family pearls that had been offered by his mother with surprising warmth and acceptance. The ceremony itself was conducted by the local vicar who had baptized Edmund and who spoke eloquently of love that transcended social boundaries and marriage that united hearts rather than merely estates. Edmund's parents, initially shocked by their son's choice, had come to appreciate Lydia's genuine qualities and her obvious devotion to their son's happiness. As they exchanged vows in the chapel where Edmund's ancestors had worshipped for generations, Lydia felt the weight of her deception finally lifting from her shoulders. She was no longer Miss Lydia Ashford, the fictional creation who had never truly existed, but Mrs. Edmund Blackwood, a woman whose worth was based on her chosen character rather than her accidental circumstances. The reception, held in the Great Hall of Blackwood Hall, brought together a carefully selected group of family and friends who had been prepared for the unconventional nature of the match. The conversations that evening focused on future plans rather than past deceptions, on shared interests rather than social divisions, on the courage required to choose love over convention. Edmund's toast to his bride struck a note that would define their life together. "To Lydia, who has taught me that nobility is earned rather than inherited, and that the greatest adventures begin when we have the courage to look beyond surface appearances to discover the truth that lies beneath." As their wedding day drew to a close and they prepared to begin their married life together, Lydia reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from the seamstress shops of Cheapside to the ancient halls of Derbyshire. The deception that had enabled her transformation had ultimately given way to honesty that made genuine love possible. The young woman who had falsified her noble blood had discovered that true nobility lay not in inherited titles or accumulated wealth, but in the courage to love honestly, the strength to choose principle over prejudice, and the wisdom to recognize that the human heart, when given freedom to choose, invariably selects character over circumstance. Their story would become legend among those who knew them, not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of deception, but as an inspiring example of love's power to transform not merely individual lives, but the very social structures that seek to constrain human potential. In choosing each other despite the obstacles that society had placed between them, Edmund and Lydia had proven that the most powerful nobility was that which people claimed for themselves through their choices, their integrity, and their unwavering commitment to truth. As carriages carried their wedding guests back to their own estates and the ancient halls of Blackwood Hall settled into nighttime quiet, Edmund and Lydia stood together in the garden where moonlight illuminated the same roses that had bloomed for his ancestors, knowing that they had written a new chapter in the ongoing story of love's victory over prejudice, courage over convention, and truth over the comfortable lies that societies tell themselves about worth and value. The young lady who had forged her noble blood had discovered that the greatest alchemy was not the transformation of base metal into gold, but the miracle of two hearts choosing to trust each other completely, creating from that trust and nobility that no accident of birth could bestow and no social convention could diminish.